She pulled the trigger before the sheriff even touched his holster. The bottle exploded in the town square, and every mouth in Redstone Creek fell open. A woman, dusty boots, frayed skirt, dark hair whipping in the Wyoming wind, had just outshot the law in front of the whole town. But that bullet didn't just shatter glass. It painted a target on her back. Because the most powerful man in the county wants her land. Her cattle are disappearing. Her fences are being cut. Her best horse was poisoned in the night. And the one man willing to help her, a stranger with ice-blue eyes who watches her hands instead of her face, carries a secret that could destroy them both. He killed a 17-year-old boy, not a criminal, not an outlaw. A kid carrying a wooden toy gun in a dark alley. Now his hands shake every time he reaches for his weapon. He can't fire a shot without seeing that boy fall. A woman who can't stop fighting. A man who can't pull the trigger. And a dead father whose grave holds a truth that someone in this town will kill to keep buried. You're listening to Wild West Stories channel. Your home for tales of frontier grit, untamed love, and the cowboys and outlaws who shape the American West. If the dust and the danger call to your soul, you're in the right place. This story reminds us that real courage isn't about never being afraid. It's about standing up when your hands are shaking and your back is against the wall. And that the deepest wounds we carry aren't from bullets. They're from the moments we failed someone and the long road back to becoming worthy of a second chance. Now, before we saddle up, if you're the kind of soul who lives for stories like this, tap that subscribe button and ring the bell. We ride every week. Tell me in the comments. Would you have trusted a stranger who couldn't even trust his own hands? And if you know someone who needs a powerful story tonight, send this their way. Now lean in close. This one cuts deep.
The bullet left the barrel before Lily had time to decide whether she was doing the bravest or the stupidest thing of her life. By the time the glass bottle exploded in the middle of Redstone Creek's town square, she knew the answer was both. The sound cracked across the dusty street like a whip, sharp and final. Every head turned. Every conversation stopped dead. The bottle that Sheriff Wade Coleman had set up on the fence post not 10 seconds earlier was nothing but a scatter of glass winking in the August sun, and the sheriff himself stood frozen, with his revolver still holstered and his mouth hanging open like a fish pulled from the creek. Lily Catherine lowered her father's rifle slowly. Smoke curled from the barrel, and the Wyoming wind caught it and carried it off toward the Bighorn foothills that rose blue and ancient to the west. Her hands were steady. They were always steady when she held this rifle. It was the rest of her life that shook. She had not meant to do it. Truly, she had not. She had ridden into Redstone Creek that morning with a short list in her head. Flour, salt, ammunition, coffee if there was money left, which there probably would not be. She had told herself the same thing she told herself every time she came to town. Keep your head down, buy what you need, go home, do not engage with anyone. But then, she had heard Coleman. The sheriff had been running what he called a marksmanship demonstration in the square, which really meant he was showing off for the miners' wives and the shopkeepers who had nothing better to do on a Tuesday morning. He had set up 5 bottles on the fence rail and was knocking them down one by one with his Colt, each shot drawing a polite scatter of applause from the gathered crowd. He was not a bad shot. Lily would give him that. He was not a good one either, but he was not bad. And the crowd did not know the difference. It was what he said between shots that got under her skin like a splinter. No woman alive could match a man's aim. That was what he declared, loud enough to carry across the whole street. He said it with the casual confidence of a man who had never been proven wrong, because no one had ever bothered to try. He said women's hands were too small, their nerves too jumpy, their eyes not built for the work of precision shooting. He said it was just a fact of nature, same as water running downhill or the sun rising in the east. And Lily heard her father's voice in her memory, clear as a church bell on a still morning. Do not you ever let anyone tell you what you cannot do just because of what you are, Lily girl. Thomas Catherine had taught her to shoot when she was 12 years old. He had put that rifle in her hands and shown her how to breathe, how to sight, how to squeeze the trigger instead of pulling it. He had told her the rifle was a tool, same as a hammer or a plow, and a tool did not care whether the hand holding it belonged to a man or a woman. It cared only whether that hand was steady, and that eye was true. Thomas Catherine had been dead for 6 years now, but his rifle was still in her hands, and his voice was still in her head. And when Wade Coleman declared to the whole town that no woman could shoot worth a damn, something in Lily's chest went tight and hot, and she was raising the rifle before her better judgment could stop her. She shot the 6th bottle off the rail from 40 yards away, while Coleman was still reaching for a fresh cartridge. The silence that followed was the loudest thing she had ever heard. Then the murmuring started, low and uneasy, the way a herd shifts before a storm. Lily became aware of dozens of eyes on her. She became aware of the dust on her boots and the frayed hem of her riding skirt, and the fact that her dark hair was coming loose from its braid and whipping across her face in the hot wind. She looked like what she was, a ranch woman, a working woman, a woman who had no business being in this square with a rifle that still smelled of powder smoke and a crowd that did not know whether to clap or call the sheriff. Coleman's face had gone the color of raw beef. He was a proud man, broad-shouldered and thick around the middle, with a mustache he waxed every morning before he pinned on his badge. Pride was the engine that ran Wade Coleman, and Lily had just poured sand in it in front of half the town. She should have walked away right then. She knew that. But her eye caught something in the crowd, or rather someone, and the words she had been forming died on her tongue. A stranger stood apart from the others, leaning against the post of the mercantile awning with his arms crossed and his hat tipped forward against the sun. He was tall and lean with sun-darkened skin, and eyes so pale they looked like winter sky and a face burned brown by years of open country. He wore trail dust on his clothes and weariness in the set of his shoulders, and he had the look of a man who had been riding a long time and was not sure he had arrived anywhere worth stopping. He was not clapping. He was not whistling. He was not staring at the broken glass on the ground like everyone else. He was watching her hands. Lily felt something shift in her chest, a small adjustment like a rifle sight clicking into place. This man was not admiring the trick shot. He was reading her technique, studying the way she held the stock, the way her left hand supported the barrel, the way she had controlled the recoil. He was looking at her the way a horseman looked at another horseman's seat in the saddle, not with judgment, with recognition. That unsettled her more than any compliment would have. The stranger pushed off the post and walked toward her, and the crowd parted for him without being asked. Up close, he was younger than she had guessed, maybe 27 or 28, but his eyes were older than that. There were lines around them from squinting into too many sunsets, and a wariness in the way he moved that spoke of a man who catalogued every exit and every threat without appearing to look at anything at all. He did not offer flattery. He did not say well done or fine shooting or any of the things men said when a woman surprised them. Instead, he asked a question that stopped Lily cold. You shoot right-handed, but you sight with your left eye. Who taught you to manage cross-dominance like that? Lily stared at him. Cross-eye dominance was a technical detail that most shooters never even heard of, let alone noticed in someone else from 40 yards away. Her father had discovered it when she was 13, had spent weeks adjusting her stance and her grip to compensate for the fact that her dominant eye and her dominant hand did not match. It was the single hardest thing she had ever learned to do with a rifle, and this stranger had spotted it in one shot. My father, she said carefully. The stranger nodded once, as if that confirmed something he already suspected. He must have been a fine teacher. Before Lily could respond, Coleman's voice cut across the square like a dull blade. You there, drifter. Move along. This is town business. The sheriff's hand rested on his holster, though whether he meant it as a threat or just needed something to do with his shaking fingers, Lily could not tell. The stranger tipped his hat to Coleman and then to Lily, and turned to walk away. That was when she noticed something that would stay with her long after the crowd had scattered, and the broken glass had been swept from the dirt. As the stranger turned, his hand moved toward his hip in what should have been a natural motion for any man wearing a gun belt. But instead of resting on the butt of his pistol the way a Western man's hand did 100 times a day without thinking, his fingers stopped short, pulled back, settled on his belt buckle instead. He kept his hand away from that weapon with the deliberate care of a man avoiding a hot stove. He wore a gun the way some men wore a scar, like something he could not take off but wished he could. Lily watched him walk away down the main street. She watched him stop outside the doctor's office and exchange words with Doc Whitfield. And even from this distance, she could see they were not strangers. There was familiarity in the way they stood, the way Doc clasped the younger man's arm. They knew each other. She filed that away and turned back to Coleman, who was doing his best to pretend the last 3 minutes had not happened. "Sheriff, I am here about the cattle thefts." Again, Coleman's jaw worked beneath his mustache. "Miss Catherine, I have told you. I will look into it when I have time. You have been saying that for 3 months. I have lost 11 head. That is money I cannot afford to lose, and you know it." Coleman would not meet her eyes. "I am aware of your situation. I will get to it. Now, if you will excuse me, I have duties to attend to." He walked away. Lily stood in the square with her rifle and her anger and the knowledge that the law in Redstone Creek was about as useful as a screen door on a submarine. She had known that for years. She just kept hoping she was wrong. As she mounted her horse, she glanced up at the building that housed the bank and the lending office, and the chambers of Judge Emmett Halstead, Justice of the Peace, and the richest man in the county. The window on the second floor was open despite the heat, and Halstead was standing behind it. He was not watching the square. He was not watching the sheriff. He was watching her. Lily held his gaze for a long moment, then turned her horse toward home. She rode past the general store and the blacksmith and the boarding house. She rode past the little cemetery on the eastern edge of town, where her father lay buried under Wyoming dirt, and a simple stone marker that read, "Thomas James Catherine, beloved father, 1831 to 1867. Heart failure, the doctor had said. Sudden cardiac arrest." "These things happen sometimes, Miss Catherine. I am sorry." Thomas Catherine had been 42 years old. He had never been sick a day in his life. He could throw hay bales from dawn until dusk and still have the energy to teach his daughter to shoot in the evening light. He ate well, slept well, worked hard, and woke every morning with a vitality that made younger men look lazy. And then one morning, he simply did not wake up. Lily had never quite believed it. She did not know what she believed instead. She only knew that something in the story did not sit right, like a picture hung crooked on a wall. You could not say exactly what was wrong with it, but you could not stop noticing it either. She clicked her tongue and her horse picked up the pace, and Redstone Creek fell away behind her as the road opened up into the wide golden grassland that stretched toward the mountains. She had flour to buy, and a ranch to save, and 11 stolen cattle that nobody was going to find for her. She did not have time to think about handsome strangers who watched her hands instead of her face. She did not have time to wonder why a man who wore a gun would be afraid to touch it. She told herself that all the way home. She almost believed it. Kieran Zachary had changed towns 9 times in 2 years, and every time he left, someone was either chasing him or burying someone he had failed to save. He woke in the dark with his shirt soaked through, and the taste of rain in his mouth and the echo of a gunshot still ringing in his skull. The boarding house room was hot and close, the air thick with the smell of old wood and dust, and for a long, terrible moment he did not know where he was. Abilene, Dodge City, Cheyenne. They all blurred together after a while, all those dark rooms and all those dying towns. All those nights he woke up reaching for a weapon he no longer trusted himself to use. Then the details settled. The narrow bed, the washstand with the cracked mirror, the window that looked out onto the main street of Redstone Creek, Wyoming territory, where a dog was barking at nothing and the morning light was just starting to pink up the eastern sky. Not Abilene. Not anymore. But the dream had been Abilene, as it always was. The alley behind the saloon, the rain coming down in sheets, turning the dirt to mud. Kieran had been tracking a man named Frank Holt, wanted for armed robbery and assault in 2 counties, worth $200 alive and 100 dead. Kieran had tracked Holt for 3 weeks across half of Kansas, and that night he had finally cornered him in the maze of alleys behind Abilene's main street. The shape had appeared at the mouth of the alley. A figure in the dark, shorter than Kieran expected, raising something in both hands. In the rain and the shadows, it looked exactly like a pistol. Kieran's body had done what 2 years of bounty hunting had trained it to do. He drew and fired in a single motion, faster than thought, faster than doubt. The sound of the shot, the figure crumpling. And then the other sound, the sound that would follow Kieran for the rest of his life. Not a pistol hitting the ground. Something lighter. Something hollow. A wooden gun, carved from pine, painted black. The kind of thing a boy might make to play at being a cowboy. Billy Pruitt was 17 years old. He had been cutting through the alley on his way home from his job at the livery stable. He had been carrying the wooden gun his father had made him for his 8th birthday, a childhood keepsake he kept in his coat pocket, the way some men kept a lucky coin. He had pulled it out in the dark for no reason that anyone would ever know. Maybe he heard footsteps. Maybe he was playing. Maybe he was just a boy doing what boys do. Kieran had knelt in the mud beside him and held the boy's hand while the light went out of his eyes. Frank Holt had escaped in the confusion. The law had cleared Kieran. Justifiable use of force, the judge said. Mistaken threat in conditions of limited visibility. No charges filed. The Pruitt family had filed something of their own. A private bounty of $500 for the man who killed their son. Not sanctioned by any court. Not legally enforceable. But printed on posters that appeared in every town from Abilene to the Montana border. Since that night, Kieran had not drawn his pistol on another human being. His hands shook when he aimed at anything that had the shape of a person. The body remembered what the mind wanted to forget, and his body had decided that the price of one more mistake was too high to pay. He carried the gun because a man without a gun in Wyoming territory was a dead man walking. He could not use it. He wore it like a scar he could not cut out. Kieran dressed and splashed water on his face from the washstand and went downstairs into the morning. Redstone Creek was just waking up. A freighter was unloading barrels at the general store. 2 miners were arguing outside the assay office. A woman in a blue dress was sweeping the boardwalk in front of the milliner's shop. Normal people doing normal things in a normal town, and Kieran watched them with the hunger of a man who wanted nothing in the world more than to be ordinary. He walked to Doc Whitfield's office at the end of the main street. The shingle above the door read ER. Whitfield, physician and surgeon, and the paint was peeling and the hinges needed oil, but the glass in the window was clean and there were geraniums in a pot on the sill. Doc cared about appearances, even when the appearances were modest. Doc opened the door before Kieran knocked. He was a tall man gone soft in the middle, 63 years old with spectacles that were perpetually smudged and a white beard that needed trimming. His eyes were kind and tired, and carried something behind them that Kieran had learned to recognize in his own mirror. Guilt. The particular weariness of a man who knew he had done something wrong and had not yet found the courage to make it right. Doc Whitfield had served as a frontier surgeon in the war, stationed at the same field hospital as Kieran's father. They had saved lives together and lost lives together and formed the kind of bond that only men who have seen the inside of other men can understand. When Kieran's father died of consumption in '71, Doc was the one who wrote the letter. When Kieran's life fell apart in Abilene, Doc was the one who wrote again, this time with an offer. Come to Redstone Creek. There is honest work here and a woman who needs help but is too stubborn to ask for it. Come and be useful, boy. It will do you good. Kieran had come because he had nowhere else to go, and because Doc was the last person alive who called him boy, and because honest work sounded like salvation to a man drowning in his own past. Now they sat in Doc's cramped office with coffee that was more chicory than bean, and Doc laid it out plain. Her name is Lily Catherine. She runs a ranch about 4 miles west of town with her younger brother Samuel. The boy is 16. Their father Thomas died 6 years ago. Heart failure, I put on the certificate. Doc paused and looked into his coffee cup as if the answers might be floating in it. She has been losing cattle for 3 months. Someone is cutting her fences and running off her stock. She owes a mortgage to Judge Halstead's lending office, and she cannot make the payments if she keeps losing animals at this rate. Kieran listened without interrupting. He had learned that skill as a tracker. Patience was the most valuable tool a man could carry. Halstead wants her land, Doc continued. He has wanted it for years, offered to buy it right after Thomas died. The week after the funeral, Kieran, before the flowers had wilted on the grave. And she refused. She has been refusing ever since, and Halstead has been patient. But I believe he is done being patient. You think Halstead is behind the cattle theft? I think it. I cannot prove it. She has been to Coleman a dozen times, and Coleman will not lift a finger because she is a woman and he is a fool, and that is a combination that has never produced anything useful in the history of the territory. Doc set down his cup and looked at Kieran with an expression that was part hope and part desperation. She needs help. The kind of help that knows how to read sign and track men and figure out who is doing what to whom. She will not ask for it because she does not trust anyone, and frankly, I cannot blame her. But if someone were to ride out there and offer, she might say yes. Kieran considered this. Why me, Doc? Why not hire a Pinkerton or bring in a territorial marshal? Because a Pinkerton costs money she does not have, and a marshal takes months to request. And because I know you, Kieran, I know what you are and what you are trying to become, and I think this might be good for both of you. There was something else. Kieran could see it in the way Doc kept rubbing his thumb along the handle of his cup, the way his eyes would not stay in one place. What are you not telling me? Doc was quiet for a long time. The clock on the wall ticked. A horse clopped past the window. Her father died 6 years ago. I signed the death certificate, and I have not slept well since. What does that mean? Doc shook his head. Not yet. I am not ready to say it out loud yet. Just go help her, Kieran. Please. Kieran rode out to the Catherine Ranch that afternoon. The road west of town climbed through grassland and scattered pine before opening into a valley that was as pretty a piece of country as he had seen in 5 years of drifting. The Bighorn foothills rose to the north, snow still clinging to the high peaks even in August. To the south, the land rolled out in waves of yellow grass that caught the wind like an ocean made of earth. The ranch house sat in the middle of it all, a solid 2-story structure of hewn logs and river stone, with a barn and a corral and the remains of what had once been a proper bunkhouse for hired hands. It looked like a place that had been prosperous once, and was hanging on by its fingernails now. Fences needed mending. The barn roof sagged on one side. The corral gate was held shut with wire instead of a proper latch. But the house itself was well kept. The windows were clean. There were curtains. Someone was fighting to maintain dignity in the face of slow ruin, and Kieran respected that more than he could say. He did not make it to the front gate. The boy appeared from behind the barn with a double-barreled shotgun leveled at Kieran's chest from 15 yards away. He was young, dark-haired and serious-eyed, with the lean build of someone who had been doing a man's work since before his body was ready for it. His finger was on the trigger, and his eyes were steady, and there was not a flicker of uncertainty in his face. This was not a bluff. This boy would shoot. Kieran threw himself sideways off his horse and hit the ground hard enough to knock the wind out of his lungs. He lay flat in the dirt with his hands spread wide and his face in the grass, and shouted the only words he thought might keep him alive. Doc Whitfield sent me. My name is Kieran Zachary. Doc Whitfield sent me. Do not shoot. A long, terrible silence. Then a voice from the porch, female, sharp, controlled. Samuel, lower the gun. The boy did not lower it immediately. He held it for 3 more seconds that felt like 30, his eyes never leaving Kieran's prostrate form. Then the barrels tilted toward the ground and Kieran allowed himself to breathe. He got to his feet slowly, brushing dirt from his shirt, and looked up at the woman standing on the porch. She had changed from the riding skirt she had worn in town to a simple work dress, and her dark hair was pulled back tight, and she held her father's rifle in the crook of her arm the way other women held a shawl. She recognized him. He could see it in the way her eyes narrowed. "You are the man from the square. The one who asked about cross-eye dominance? Yes, ma'am. And Doc Whitfield sent you." "He did. He said you might have need of a ranch hand." Lily, Catherine studied him the way she had studied him in the square, with that careful, assessing gaze that missed nothing and gave nothing away. He felt as though she were reading him like a page in a book, and he was not sure she liked the story. "1 week," she said finally. "No pay. You sleep in the tack shed, not the bunkhouse. And if I see anything at all, that I do not like, you leave with a hole in your hat. Are we clear?" "Clear as creek water," Kieran said. She turned and went inside without another word. Samuel lingered, the shotgun still in his hands. "I am watching you," the boy said. "I would expect nothing less," Kieran replied. That evening, after a supper of beans and cornbread that he ate alone in the tack shed because he had not been invited to the house, Kieran unpacked his saddlebags and set his pistol on the highest shelf he could reach, as far from his sleeping hand as the small room would allow. He had not fired it at a living thing in 2 years. He intended to keep it that way. Through the thin walls, he could hear the sounds of the ranch settling into night. A horse shifting in the corral, an owl calling from the tree line, and underneath it all, a faint, rhythmic sound he could not quite place. He cracked the tack shed door and looked out. Samuel was sitting on the porch step in the last light of the day, whittling, a small block of pine in one hand, a knife in the other, his face bent in concentration. The boy's hands moved with a gentleness and precision that seemed to belong to a different person than the one who had aimed a shotgun at Kieran's chest 3 hours earlier. He was carving a horse. A small one, no bigger than his fist. Kieran watched for a moment, then closed the door quietly. Something about the sight of those careful hands making something instead of destroying something stuck in his chest like a thorn. He lay on the thin cot and stared at the ceiling and thought about wooden guns and dead boys and second chances he did not deserve. Sometime past midnight, he heard footsteps outside, slow, deliberate, circling the tack shed with the patience of a predator. He reached for the shelf where his pistol sat, and his hand stopped 6 inches short. The footsteps faded into the darkness toward the western pasture. Kieran did not sleep again that night. On the 3rd day, the best horse on the Catherine Ranch dropped dead in its stall, and it had not died of anything God made. Lily found the animal in the morning when she went to the barn to start the day's work. The mare was a 6-year-old bay named Penny, the finest breeding stock on the property, worth more than everything else in the barn combined. She lay on her side in the straw with her legs stiff and her eyes glazed, and a foam of saliva dried white around her mouth. She had died in convulsions sometime in the night, and the expression frozen on her long face was one of agony. Lily stood in the stall doorway and felt the ground shift beneath her feet. Not literally. The ground in Wyoming was as solid as anything on earth. But the ground of her life, the foundation she had been building and rebuilding since her father's death, that ground was cracking, and she could feel herself starting to fall through. She did not cry. Lily Catherine had not cried since the night she buried her father. And she was not about to start now over a horse, even a horse she had raised from a foal and loved with the uncomplicated affection she found so difficult to give to people. She pressed her lips together and breathed through her nose and made her hands into fists at her sides. Kieran appeared behind her. He had been awake since before dawn, she had noticed. He seemed to sleep in 2-hour stretches at most, rising in the dark to walk the fence line and check the stock, and do the quiet work of a man who felt he needed to earn his place every hour. He looked at the dead horse, and his expression went flat and hard. "Do not touch anything," he said. And he stepped past her into the stall. He examined the mare with the careful attention of someone who had seen death before and knew how to read its handwriting. He checked the mouth, the eyes, the nostrils. He ran his hands along the animal's belly and legs. Then he went to the water trough in the corner of the stall and crouched beside it, sniffing the water, dipping a finger in and touching it to his tongue before spitting quickly into the straw. "Strychnine," he said. "Rat poison. Someone put it in the trough." Lily felt the anger rise in her like a brush fire, fast and hot and consuming. 3 months. 3 months of cut fences and stolen cattle, and a sheriff who could not be bothered to ride 4 miles from town to look at a crime scene. And now this. Now they were killing her animals. "How can you tell?" she asked. And her voice was flat because she was holding everything else back with both hands, the foam around the mouth, the convulsions. She died in spasms. You can see it in the way the legs locked. And the water smells like garlic. That is the strychnine. He stood up and crossed to the barn door. But that is not all. He led her outside and showed her the ground beside the trough where the dirt was soft from a leak in the water line. There were boot prints there, not the flat, worn soles of cowboy boots that every ranch hand in the territory wore. These prints were different. They had hobnails, short metal studs driven into the sole in a distinctive pattern. "This is not a ranch hand's work," Kieran said. "Hobnails like these belong to a miner or a townsman, someone who walks on rock, not dirt." He took her to the fence line next, to the section that had been cut 2 nights ago. He showed her the horseshoe prints he had found on his first day and kept to himself, waiting until he had more of the picture. The shoes had an unusual pattern. The nail holes were set in a wide fan rather than the standard narrow row, and the heel caulks were higher than normal. "There is only one farrier in the territory whose shoes like this," Kieran said. "His name is Hank Bassett. He works exclusively for one ranch." Lily did not need him to say which one. The evidence was building piece by piece, like a case being assembled for a trial that might never come. The brass button stamped with a letter H that Samuel had found near the cut fence, the hobnail boot prints, the distinctive horseshoe pattern, the strychnine which was sold at the town pharmacy where Judge Emmett Halstead held the primary account. None of it was proof, not the kind that would stand up in a hearing before a justice of the peace, especially when the justice of the peace was the man you were accusing. But it painted a picture clear enough for anyone with eyes to see. "Halstead," Lily said. The word tasted like ash. "Everything points that direction," Kieran agreed. Lily looked out at her ranch, at the fence lines running off toward the mountains and the cattle dotting the far pasture, and the house where she had been born and where her father had died. She had fought for this place for 6 years. She had fought drought and debt and loneliness and the particular cruelty of a world that did not believe a woman could run a cattle operation alone. She had fought and she had held on, and she had told herself every single day that the fighting was worth it because this land was her father's legacy and she would not let it go. And now someone was poisoning her horses. She hit the fence post. Not a slap, not a tap. She drove her fist into the rough wood with everything she had, and the skin split across her knuckles and blood ran down her wrist. And the pain that flared through her hand was almost a relief, because at least it was something she could feel instead of this vast, suffocating rage that had no target, and no outlet, and no end. Kieran did not flinch. He did not reach for her. He did not offer comfort or sympathy, or any of the soft, useless words that people said when they did not know what else to do. He tore a strip from the bottom of his own shirt, a long piece of faded cotton, and held it out to her. "That hand can outshoot the sheriff," he said quietly. "Do not break it on a fence post." Lily stared at him, at the strip of fabric in his outstretched hand, at the calm in his winter sky eyes and the absence of pity in his voice. He was not treating her like a woman having a breakdown. He was treating her like a shooter who needed to take care of her equipment. The practicality of it, the utter lack of sentimentality, did something to the knot in her chest that 6 years of kind words from well-meaning neighbors had never managed. It loosened it, just a little, just enough. She took the cloth and wrapped her hand and said nothing. And they stood there in the August heat with the dead horse in the barn behind them, and the evidence of sabotage all around them. And something shifted between them that neither of them acknowledged, but both of them felt. That was the 3rd day. The first 2 days had not been any easier. On the first morning of Kieran's trial week, Lily had walked out to find the well contaminated. Someone had thrown a dead coyote down the shaft in the night, fouling the water with rot and bacteria. It would take 3 days to clean and treat before the water was safe again. In the meantime, they hauled water from the creek half a mile away, bucket by bucket, trip after trip, until Lily's shoulders ached and Samuel's young face was gray with exhaustion. On the second night, the fence on the north pasture was cut again. 3 more head of cattle wandered off through the gap before morning. Samuel found the tracks at dawn and followed them for 2 miles before losing the trail on rocky ground. Lily watched the attacks escalate and felt the noose tightening. And she watched Kieran Zachary move through the wreckage like a man who had been waiting all his life for something useful to do. He was not what she had expected. She had expected a drifter, a man passing through, someone who would do a few days' work and move on when the trouble got too thick. Instead, she got a man who rose before dawn and worked past dark, who fixed fences and cleaned the fouled well and hauled water without complaint, who ate alone in the tack shed and never asked for anything, and seemed to require no more sleep than a barn cat. She also got a man with secrets. "You are not just a drifting cowhand, are you?" she said on the third evening, after the horse and the boot prints and the bloodied knuckles. Kieran was quiet for a long time. They were sitting on the porch, Lily with her bandaged hand and Kieran with a cup of coffee that had gone cold. Samuel was inside doing the dishes, and the last of the daylight was draining out of the sky like water from a bathtub, slow and gold and reluctant. "No," he said finally. "I am not. But I am trying to become one." "What were you before?" "Somebody else." She wanted to push. She could feel the questions stacking up inside her like rounds in a magazine. But something in his voice, a tiredness that went deeper than muscles and bones, told her that pushing now would break something that was not yet strong enough to bend. "All right," she said. "When you are ready to tell me, I will be ready to listen." And she meant it. That surprised her more than anything. The rest of the week passed in a blur of work and vigilance and the slow, careful construction of something that was not yet trust, but might someday become it. Lily offered Kieran paid employment on the 7th day. "Fair wages," she said. "Room in the bunkhouse instead of the tack shed. And I will not ask about your past again until you want to tell me." Kieran accepted. They shook hands on it, and Lily tried not to notice the warmth of his calloused palm against hers, or the way his winter sky eyes held hers for just a moment longer than necessary. It was that evening, while the 3 of them sat on the porch in the kind of comfortable silence that takes days of shared work to earn, that things took a turn Lily did not see coming. Richard Halstead had appeared at the general store that afternoon, while Lily was buying the week's supplies. The judge's son was 26, educated back east, with soft hands and a smile that never quite reached his eyes. He was polite. He was courteous. He expressed concern about the difficulties facing ranchers in the current economy. And then, almost casually, he mentioned the Western Creek on Lily's property by name. "It is a shame about that creek drying up in the summers," he said. "Must make watering the stock difficult in the back pasture." Lily had smiled and nodded and said nothing, but her blood had gone cold. The Western Creek was on the far edge of her property, tucked behind a ridge that you could not see from any public road. The only way to know about that creek was to have been on her land. Someone had been watching her property closely and for a long time, and that someone had reported back to the Halsteads. She told Kieran and Samuel about it that evening and watched Kieran's expression darken. "They know the land better than I would have thought," he said. "This is not casual observation. Someone has been mapping your property." Samuel sat on the porch step with his whittling knife and a small block of pine. He had been carving a horse, working on it every evening for the past week. Kieran watched him and asked what he was making. "Pa taught me," Samuel said without looking up. "Said hands ought to know how to make something before they learn how to break it." Kieran stared at the small wooden figure for a long time. Something moved across his face, there and gone, like a cloud shadow racing across the grassland. Then he looked away and said nothing. Later that night, after Lily and Kieran had turned in, Samuel did something he had not told his sister about. He saddled his horse and rode into town alone, slipping through the dark streets to the notice board outside the sheriff's office. He had been thinking about Kieran Zachary for days, thinking about the way the man avoided his own gun, thinking about the way he had come out of nowhere with skills that did not belong to any ordinary cowhand, thinking about the way Coleman had looked at him in the square, not with the annoyance of a lawman confronting a stranger, but with the sharp attention of a man who recognized something. In the light of a single lantern, Samuel found what he was looking for. A wanted poster, freshly pinned, bearing a face he recognized and a name he had come to know. Kieran Zachary, wanted for the killing of William Billy Pruitt, age 17, in Abilene, Kansas. $500 reward offered by the Pruitt family. Samuel tore the poster down. He folded it carefully and put it in his coat pocket and rode home in the dark with the weight of it pressing against his chest like a stone. He had a decision to make. He could give it to Coleman and collect whatever favor the sheriff might offer. He could confront Kieran himself, or he could do what he always did when the world presented him with a problem too large for his 16 years. He could bring it to Lily. Lily had killed a man on these very porch steps 2 years ago, and now she was sheltering another killer under her roof. Samuel showed her the poster at dawn before the sun had cleared the mountains and while the dew was still heavy on the grass. He stood in her bedroom doorway with his serious eyes and his careful hands and held out the folded paper without a word. Lily read it twice, the first time to understand the words, the second time to understand what they meant. "Where did you get this?" "Coleman's notice board. Last night. You rode into town alone. In the dark. I had to know." Samuel's jaw was set in a way that reminded her so painfully of their father that she had to look away. "He is living on our property, Lily. I had to know who he was. And you did not take this to the sheriff." "No. I brought it to you. Because you decide. You always decide." There was something in his voice that was more than statement. There was weight in it. Years of weight. The accumulated burden of a boy who had watched his sister carry every hard decision since the day their father died. He was not complaining. He was simply telling the truth, and the truth was that he was tired. Lily looked at the poster again. The rough sketch of Kieran's face, approximate but recognizable. The words that reduced a man's worst moment to 3 lines of type. Wanted. Killing. 17. She picked up her father's rifle. They found Kieran in the barn, already working, mucking out stalls with the steady rhythm of a man who used physical labor the way some men used whiskey, to keep the bad thoughts at a distance. He saw Lily and the rifle and Samuel and the shotgun, and he set down the pitchfork and stood very still. The morning light came through the barn door behind him, silhouetting his lean frame, and Lily thought absurdly that he looked like a man standing in a church window, waiting for judgment. She held up the poster. "You killed a 17-year-old boy?" The silence that followed was the kind that had texture to it. Heavy, thick, something you could almost reach out and touch. A horse stamped in its stall. A bird sang somewhere in the cottonwoods. And Kieran Zachary stood in the barn with his hands at his sides and his winter sky eyes on Lily, and began to speak. He told her everything. The bounty on Frank Holt, the 3 weeks of tracking across Kansas, the rain-soaked alley in Abilene, the shape at the end of the passage, small, lifting something in both hands, the way the body made decisions before the mind could intervene, the way 2 years of hunting dangerous men had turned his reflexes into something he could not control. The crack of the pistol, the boy falling, the sound, that sound, the hollow clatter of a wooden gun hitting wet stone. Billy Pruitt, 17 years old, on his way home from the livery stable, carrying a toy his father had made him when he was 8. Dead before he hit the ground because a man in the dark had seen a weapon where there was only pine and paint. "The court cleared me," Kieran said, and his voice was steady, but his hands were not. Justifiable force. Mistaken threat. No charges filed. The judge said I acted within reason given the circumstances. And the poster? The Pruitt family. Private bounty. $500. He paused. I do not ask you to forgive me. I have not forgiven myself. Lily looked at him standing there in the barn with the morning light behind him and the truth laid out between them like a body on a table. She thought about what it would feel like to carry that weight. To know that your hands had taken a life that should not have been taken. That your skill and your training and your instincts had conspired to do the worst thing imaginable, and to live with that every single day. She knew, because she carried a weight of her own. She lowered the rifle, not because she believed him, not because she trusted him, because she understood. 2 years ago, she said, and her voice was very quiet, very controlled. A man named Tom Slade came to this ranch in the middle of the night. He broke through the back door. I do not know what he wanted. Money, maybe. Maybe something else. I was alone because Samuel was in town staying with a friend. And I heard the glass break, and I grabbed this rifle, and I came out onto the porch. She paused. The memory was sharp-edged, the kind that cut you every time you picked it up. He was on the steps, coming toward me. He had a knife. I shot him. Self-defense, clean and legal. Coleman himself said so. The whole town said so. Nobody blamed me. Kieran watched her, waiting. But I fired twice, Lily said. The first shot stopped him. He was already falling, already going down. And I pulled the trigger again. The second bullet hit him in the chest as he was falling, and I have never, not once in 2 years, been able to figure out whether that second shot was self-defense or anger. The barn was quiet, except for the breathing of horses and the distant call of a meadowlark. 2 people stood in the half-light, each holding a truth they had never spoken aloud, and the space between them was not a gap, but a bridge. It was Samuel who broke the silence, because Samuel was 16 and had no patience for the careful dance of adults circling their own pain. All right, so you have both killed somebody. Can we focus on whoever is killing our cattle now? Lily almost laughed. Almost. She looked at her brother and saw her father's practicality staring back at her from a young face that was too serious for its years. And she thought that Thomas Catherine would have said exactly the same thing. Kieran seemed to let out a breath he had been holding since Lily raised the rifle. He nodded slowly and turned to the workbench where he had spread out the evidence he had been collecting. The brass button with the H, a sketch of the hobnail boot prints, a drawing of the horseshoe pattern. Hank Bassett does the farrier work for Halstead's operation exclusively, he said, falling into the focused rhythm of a man who had spent years assembling cases against fugitives. He shoes their horses with this distinctive fan pattern. I have checked 3 other ranches in the area, and none of them use it. The hobnail boots match a style sold at the Halstead General Goods store in town, and the strychnine came from the pharmacy where Halstead holds the primary account. Lily sat down on a hay bale and did the math in her head. She was good at math. Her father had taught her that, too. The mortgage payment is due in 6 weeks, she said. If I cannot make it, Halstead forecloses, legally. No one could stop him. How much? Lily named the figure. It was not enormous by city standards, but for a struggling ranch that had lost 11 head of cattle and its best breeding horse, it might as well have been $1 million. Kieran was quiet for a moment. Then he said what they were all thinking. The cattle theft is not random. It is a strategy. Every head you lose pushes you closer to default. Halstead does not need to steal your ranch. He just needs to bleed it until you cannot hold on. Lily looked at the evidence spread across the workbench. She looked at Kieran, this man with blood on his hands and truth in his eyes. She looked at Samuel, her 16-year-old brother who should have been worrying about girls and fishing and the 100 small joys of youth instead of standing in a barn with a shotgun helping his sister fight for their home. She made a decision. We catch him, she said. We get proof that will hold up in front of someone besides Halstead, and we catch him. "If Coleman finds out I'm here," Kieran said carefully, "he will hand me over to the Pruitt family for the bounty money. That poster is still on his board. I know. So we had better work fast." Kieran looked at her for a long moment, and something passed between them that was not romance and not friendship and not alliance, but something older and simpler. Recognition. The acknowledgement of one wounded creature by another. "Why are you still here?" Lily asked suddenly. "You know the risk. You know what Coleman could do if he finds you. Why do you stay?" Kieran looked out the barn door at the valley, at the grass bending in the wind and the mountains standing eternal against the blue sky. "Because this is the first place in 2 years that felt worth staying for." Lily held his gaze. Then she nodded once and stood up and said the most dangerous words she had spoken since the night she shot Tom Slade on the porch. "Then let us get to work." They spent the rest of the day planning. Kieran drew maps of the property from memory, marking the places where fences had been cut and cattle had gone missing. Lily added details: the water sources, the blind spots, the terrain that would favor an approach from the west, which was the direction of the Halstead spread. Samuel rode the perimeter and came back with fresh intelligence. More tracks near the north pasture. Another section of fence tampered with, not cut this time but loosened. The wire pulled from its staples so that a strong wind or a spooked steer would bring it down. And Kieran asked a question that had been building in him since his first conversation with Doc Whitfield. "Your father. Tell me about how he died." Lily stiffened. It was subtle, a tightening of the shoulders that someone who did not know her might have missed, but Kieran had been trained to read body language the way a scholar reads text. "Heart failure. That is what Doc Whitfield said. And you believe that?" Lily was quiet for a moment. He was 42 years old. He had never been sick a day in his life. He could outwork any man in the county. And one morning, he just did not wake up. Kieran frowned but said nothing. Later, when Samuel had gone to bed and Lily was washing up in the kitchen, Kieran sat on the porch in the dark and turned the facts over in his mind the way he had once turned over evidence in fugitive cases. A healthy man dead at 42. A doctor who signed the certificate and lost sleep over it. A rich man who wanted the land and made an offer before the grave was cold. And now, 6 years later, a campaign of theft and sabotage designed to take what a simple purchase offer could not. Something did not add up, and Kieran had learned in his years of tracking men who did not want to be found that when something did not add up, it was usually because someone had taken a number off the board. The next morning, Lily rode into town for supplies. She passed the notice board outside the sheriff's office and saw what she somehow knew she would see. A fresh wanted poster bearing Kieran's face and name, crisp and new, pinned up to replace the one Samuel had torn down. And Coleman was standing beside it with his arms crossed, watching the road with the patient expression of a man waiting for someone to come claim a prize. Judge Halstead poured tea from a porcelain pot that cost more than Lily's monthly mortgage payment, and the courtesy of it was the most frightening thing she had experienced since the night Tom Slade died on her porch. The summons had come by way of Halstead's clerk, a thin, nervous man named Purdy, who rode out to the ranch with a sealed note, requesting Miss Catherine's presence at the judge's chambers at her earliest convenience. Earliest convenience, in the language of men like Halstead, meant right now, and Lily knew better than to ignore it. She told Kieran to stay out of sight and rode into town alone. Halstead's office occupied the entire second floor above the bank, and climbing those stairs felt like ascending to a gallows. The room itself was designed to intimidate without appearing to. Heavy furniture, law books lining the walls, a window that overlooked the entire main street, giving its occupant a commanding view of everything that happened below. A man who sat in this room controlled not just the view, but the town it surveyed. Halstead rose when she entered. He was 58 years old, tall and straight-backed, with silver hair and a face that belonged on a coin. He wore a dark suit even in the August heat, his collar starched white, his boots polished to a mirror shine. He was the kind of man who made you aware of your own dust. "Miss Catherine, thank you for coming. Please sit." "Tea?" He did not wait for her answer. He poured from the porcelain pot into a cup so thin the light showed through it, and set it before her with the precise hospitality of a man who understood that manners were a weapon. Everything about him spoke of control, the measured gestures, the modulated voice, the smile that arrived on schedule and departed without warmth. Lily sat. She did not touch the tea. "I will come to the point," Halstead said, settling into his chair with the ease of a man in his natural habitat. "Your mortgage payment is due in 5 weeks. Based on the unfortunate losses your ranch has suffered recently, I am concerned about your ability to meet that obligation." "Your concern is noted," Lily said flatly. Halstead inclined his head. "I do not wish to see you in difficulty, Miss Catherine. Your father was a good man. Thomas and I had our differences, but I respected him. I would like to think he would want me to look after his children's interests." The mention of her father in this man's mouth made Lily's stomach turn, but she kept her face still. "I have a proposal," Halstead continued. "I am prepared to purchase the Catherine Ranch at a fair price. Not the full market value, I will be honest about that. Times are difficult, and land prices reflect that reality. But a price that would allow you and Samuel to relocate comfortably, start fresh somewhere with less, shall we say, burden." He named a figure. 1/3 of what the land was worth on a good day, and Lily knew it, and Halstead knew she knew it. "That is not a fair price," she said. "It is the best price you will get under the circumstances. If you default on the mortgage, I will be obligated to foreclose. The law requires it, and then you will receive nothing at all." Halstead sipped his tea. "This is a generous offer, Miss Catherine. I genuinely hope you will consider it." "I have considered it. The answer is no." Something flickered behind Halstead's eyes. Not anger, not exactly. More like the brief impatience of a chess player whose opponent has made a predictable but inconvenient move. "I understand you have hired a new hand," Halstead said, changing direction with the smooth ease of a man accustomed to steering conversations. "I do hope you have checked his references. Dangerous men drift through Wyoming every season." The implication landed like a slap, quiet and precise. He knew about Kieran, of course he knew. In a town this small, a man could not buy a cup of coffee without Halstead hearing about it by supper time. "I am careful about who I hire," Lily said. "I am sure you are." Halstead set down his cup. "Miss Catherine, let me be plain. The territory is not kind to those who swim against the current. I have seen many people, good people, strong people, broken by stubbornness. I would hate to see that happen to you. Is that a threat, Judge? It is an observation. Nothing more." Lily stood. "If we are finished?" "Of course." Halstead stood as well, the gentleman seeing his guest to the door. "I hope you will think about my offer. The door is always open." Lily nodded and turned to leave. And then she saw it. On Halstead's desk, half hidden beneath a stack of legal papers, a map. Not an ordinary map. A geological survey, the kind drawn by professional teams from Denver or San Francisco, covered in grid lines and mineral annotations and symbols she did not recognize. The property outlined in red ink was hers. She could see the creek bed marked with a small diamond symbol and notations in a cramped hand. She did not stop. She did not stare. She filed the image away in her mind the way her father had taught her to file away the details of a landscape when tracking game. See everything. Show nothing. Outside, the air hit her like a wall of heat, and she stood on the boardwalk breathing hard, not from exertion, but from the effort of maintaining composure in the presence of a man who held her life in his hands and was slowly closing his fist. She remembered something her father had said once, years ago, while they were panning for crawdads in the creek. He had held up a small stone that caught the light and turned it in his fingers and said, "Look at that, Lily girl, something that glitters down in the creek bed. Might be something, might be nothing." And she had asked if they should dig for it, and Thomas Catherine had laughed and put the stone back in the water. "We are cattle people, Lily girl. Whatever is in that creek, it can stay there." Lily rode home with the image of that map burning in her mind and a new suspicion growing in her chest like a weed. Halstead did not just want her land. He wanted something under it. She found Kieran behind the barn, trying to reload his pistol. Trying was the operative word. His hands were shaking so badly that the cartridges kept slipping from his fingers, and his face was white with frustration, and something deeper, something that looked like shame. A rattlesnake had appeared near the horse corral an hour earlier. Kieran had drawn his weapon and aimed and frozen solid, his finger on the trigger and his body locked up like a rusted gate. He could not fire. Lily had killed the snake herself with a single clean shot from 20 yards, and now Kieran was in the dust behind the barn, wrestling with a gun that had become his enemy. Lily watched him for a moment. Then she walked over and crouched beside him. When did it start? Kieran did not look at her. Since Abilene. Since the boy. My hands remember what happened, and they will not let me forget. She considered this. She knew something about the body's rebellion against the mind. She knew how her own hands sometimes trembled when she stood on the porch at night, how the shadow of a man on the steps could send her heart racing even 2 years after Tom Slade had died there. "Come with me," she said. She took him to the flat ground behind the north pasture where she had set up targets years ago, old tin cans on fence posts and flour sacks stuffed with straw. She set a can on a post 50 yards out and came back to where Kieran stood. "Give me the rifle," she said, "not the pistol. Start with the rifle." He handed it over and she adjusted the sights and gave it back. She stepped behind him. "Do not think about shooting," she said. "Think about breathing. In through the nose, out through the mouth. Match my rhythm." She placed her hands over his on the stock of the rifle, her palms against the backs of his hands, her fingers curling over his fingers. She could feel the tremor in him, the fine, constant vibration of a man at war with his own nervous system. "Breathe," she said. "In, out, in, out." Slowly, over minutes that felt like hours, the trembling eased, not gone, not conquered, but quieted, the way a spooked horse could be gentled by a patient hand. "Now, sight the target. Do not squeeze the trigger yet, just sight it." She felt his breathing change as he focused. The muscles in his forearms tightened under her hands. "When you are ready," she said quietly, and stepped back. The crack of the rifle split the air, and the tin can flew off the post and spun into the grass. Kieran lowered the weapon and stood very still. He was shaking again, but this time it was the trembling that comes after something breaks loose, the way a fever breaks and leaves you weak but alive. Lily stood beside him and said nothing. She did not need to. Some moments were too important for words, and this was one of them. That evening, back at the house with Samuel, they sat around the kitchen table and planned. "We need evidence," Lily said. "Real evidence, the kind that would hold up in front of someone besides Halstead. We need witnesses that Coleman cannot dismiss, and we need to do it all before Coleman figures out who Kieran really is." She had already spoken to Doc Whitfield. Doc was terrified but willing to help, bound by guilt and the desperate hope that helping now might somehow atone for 6 years of silence. He estimated that Coleman had sent a letter to Abilene to verify the wanted poster, and that a reply would take 2 to 3 weeks by mail. That was their window. Martha Kincaid, the widow who ran the boarding house, had also agreed to help. She had her own reasons. Halstead had foreclosed on her husband's land 2 years ago. Her husband had died of a stroke 3 months later, and Martha blamed Halstead with the kind of cold, focused hatred that made her very useful and very dangerous. She knew Coleman's patrol schedule to the minute. She knew who came and went from Halstead's office. She knew the rhythms and routines of Redstone Creek, the way a spider knows its web. "Here is what I propose," Kieran said, leaning over the table where he had sketched a rough map of the ranch. "We make it look like the ranch is empty. Stage a cattle drive to the market in Casper. Take the stock out openly, make sure the whole town sees us leave. But we leave marked cattle behind." "Marked how?" Kieran explained. Fluorite, a mineral common in the old mine tailings above town, could be crushed and mixed with tallow to create a wash that was invisible in daylight but glowed faintly under torchlight. He had learned the trick from a rancher in Montana, who used it to identify stock at night roundups. If they applied the wash to a dozen head and left them in the far pasture, and if Halstead's men came to steal them, the marked cattle would be identifiable on Halstead's land. It is not courtroom evidence, Kieran admitted, but it is the kind of evidence that turns heads in a town hearing. Hard to explain how cattle wearing your neighbor's invisible brand ended up in your corral. Samuel looked between them. If this plan fails, we lose the ranch. Kieran goes to jail, and you could end up in a cell right next to him for harboring a fugitive. Lily looked at her brother. That is correct. So we had better not let it fail. No, we had better not. Later that night, when Samuel had gone to bed and the house was quiet, Lily carried 2 cups of coffee out to the barn where Kieran was mending a saddle. He looked up when she appeared, and in the lamplight his face was all planes and shadows, the hard angles softened by weariness, and something else she could not quite name. She sat on a hay bale and handed him a cup, and they drank in silence. The barn smelled of leather and hay and horse sweat, and outside the wind was moving through the grass with a sound like breathing. You could sell the ranch, Kieran said after a while. Take the money, take Samuel somewhere safe, start over. Have you ever been able to start over? A long silence. No, neither can I. They sat with that for a while. Then Lily said something that surprised them both. My father found something shining in the creek bed years ago. He never told me what it was, just said we were cattle people and whatever was in that creek could stay there. She paused. Halstead has a geological survey of my property on his desk, with the creek marked in red ink. Kieran looked at her. You think there is silver on your land. I think Halstead thinks there is silver on my land. And I think that changes everything we thought we knew about why he wants it. They sat in the barn and let the implications settle around them like dust. A dying mining town, a rich man who held mortgages and judgeships and the law itself, a silver vein under land he could not legally buy from a woman who refused to sell. Lily finished her coffee and stood to leave. Lily, Kieran said, and it was the first time he had used her name without the miss in front of it. She stopped. I am glad I came to Redstone Creek. She looked at him in the lamplight, this man with his scarred hands and his broken aim, and his winter sky eyes full of things he could not say. I am glad you came too, she said. She walked back to the house in the dark, and 3 days later she woke to the smell of smoke. The fire ate through the tack shed roof in the time it took Lily to cross the yard, and by the time she reached the door she understood 2 things. Someone had barred it from the outside, and Kieran was still in there. The bar was a fence rail, jammed across the door frame at an angle. Smoke was pouring through every crack in the walls, and the heat was a living thing, pressing against her face like a hand. She could hear Kieran inside, coughing, slamming his weight against the door that would not move. Lily grabbed the fence rail and pulled. It was wedged tight, and the wood was already hot, searing her palms. But she set her feet and hauled with everything she had. The rail came free with a screech of wood on wood, and the door burst open, and Kieran fell out into the dirt, coughing, gasping, his forearms blistered and red, where he had tried to beat out the flames on his cot. Samuel came running from the house with buckets of water, and together they fought the fire, but the tack shed was old and dry, and it went up like kindling. By the time the flames died down, there was nothing left but a smoking skeleton of charred beams and ash. Kieran's saddlebags were gone. His spare clothes, his bedroll, the few personal items he carried from town to town. Everything he owned in the world had been reduced to cinders. They sat in the yard in the pre-dawn dark and stared at the wreckage. Kieran's arms were wrapped in wet cloth that was already turning pink with seepage from the burns. Samuel's face was smeared with soot. Lily's hands were blistered from the fence rail. They looked like survivors of a battle, which in a way they were. This was not cattle theft, this was not fence cutting or well poisoning or horse killing. This was attempted murder. Someone had barred a man inside a burning building and walked away. The line between business dispute and bloodshed had been crossed, and there was no going back. You should have left when I told you to sleep in there instead of the bunkhouse, Lily said. Her voice was flat, emptied out by shock and exhaustion. I should have done a lot of things, Kieran answered. They were quiet for a while. Then Lily said the thing she had been building toward since the moment she pulled that bar free, the thing that her fear was demanding and her pride was supporting and her heart was screaming against. You need to go. Tonight. Kieran looked at her. You are a wanted man sleeping on a ranch that someone is trying to burn down. If you stay, they will catch you because of me, and I will not have another death on my conscience. Not yours. Not because of me. She stood up and crossed her arms and set her jaw and became the fortress she had spent 6 years building, high walls and barred gates, and not a crack to be found. Go. Take what is left of your horse and ride out and do not come back. I can handle this. I have always handled it. Kieran stood up slowly. His burned arms hung at his sides and his face was tight with pain, but his eyes were steady and clear. Number 1, I am not asking, and I am not leaving. You can shoot straighter than the sheriff, Lily Catherine, but you cannot shoot straight enough to make me go when I do not want to. The argument that followed was not pretty. It was raw and honest and ugly in the way that only two people who have shown each other their worst can be ugly. Lily accused him of staying out of guilt, of trying to atone for Billy Pruitt by saving someone else's ranch. Kieran accused her of pushing people away so she would never have to risk losing them, of armoring herself in independence until the armor became the prison. Both of them were right. Both of them were bleeding. And Samuel sat on the porch and watched and did not intervene because he was learning something that no one had ever taught him and that no one could teach you. He was learning that adults broke just like children, only louder and with more damage. The argument ended not with a resolution but with exhaustion. They had said everything there was to say, and none of it had changed the fundamental fact that Kieran was not leaving and Lily could not make him. Fine, Lily said. And the word carried the weight of surrender and relief in equal measure. Fine. Stay. But we move the plan up. No more waiting. Tomorrow night. Kieran nodded. Then he went to Doc Whitfield's house, walking through the dark streets of Redstone Creek at 4 a.m. with his burned arms and his aching head, because there was one more thing that needed doing before tomorrow night, and it could not wait. Doc opened the door in his nightshirt, blinking behind smudged spectacles. He took one look at Kieran's burns and pulled him inside and started treating them without a word. Because whatever else Doc Whitfield was or was not, he was still a physician, and a physician's hands did not hesitate when someone was hurt. While Doc worked, Kieran talked. Thomas Catherine was 42 years old, healthy as a draft horse, never been sick a day in his life. And he died in his sleep 6 years ago, and you signed the death certificate, and Halstead made an offer on the land before the body was cold. And now Halstead has a geological survey of Catherine land on his desk, with the creek bed marked in red. Doc's hands stopped moving. The color drained from his face like water from a cracked cup. I cannot, he whispered. You can, and you will, because if you do not, that woman is going to lose everything her father built, and you are going to carry his death on your conscience for the rest of whatever life you have left. Doc sat down heavily. He took off his spectacles and pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes, and began to speak in the broken, halting voice of a man who had been holding a confession so long it had turned to stone inside him. Halstead told me to write heart failure on the certificate. I did not examine the body properly. I did not test for anything. I was afraid, Kieran. Halstead held my note at the bank. He held my reputation in his hands. He said it was a simple thing. Just write what I tell you and everything stays as it is. And God help me, I did it. I wrote heart failure and I signed my name and I have not drawn a clean breath since. Did Halstead kill him? Doc's face crumpled. I do not know. That is the honest truth. I do not know if Thomas Catherine died of natural causes or if someone helped him along. I did not examine him carefully enough to tell, And now 6 years have passed, and the body is in the ground, and there is no way to know for certain. But I should have looked. I should have tested. I should have done my job, and I did not, and that is a sin I will answer for. Kieran looked at this broken old man and felt a complicated knot of anger and pity tighten in his chest. He wanted to rage at Doc the way Lily would rage, with that fierce, righteous fury that burned clean. But Kieran knew something about the weight of guilt, about the way a single terrible moment could define and disfigure the rest of your life. And so he swallowed his anger and said the only thing that mattered. Then help me make it right. Doc looked up. His eyes were red and his face was old and defeated, but something in the set of his mouth was changing, hardening, like soft iron finding its temper. What do you need? I need you to tell the truth, when the time comes, in front of whoever needs to hear it. Doc nodded once. It was the bravest thing he had done in 6 years. Kieran walked back to the ranch in the gray light of dawn and found Lily in the kitchen, sitting alone with her father's rifle across her knees, staring at the empty chair where Thomas Catherine used to sit. The chair had a worn spot on the left arm where Thomas would rest his hand while he drank his evening coffee, and told his children stories about the land and the cattle and the Wyoming sky. He never got sick, Lily said to no one in particular, not once in 42 years. And then one morning he just did not wake up. Samuel appeared in the doorway. He had dark circles under his eyes and straw in his hair from sleeping in the barn because the tack shed was gone and someone needed to watch the horses. I know, Samuel said quietly. I have been thinking about that too. They looked at each other, brother and sister, the only two people in the world who had loved Thomas Catherine the way he deserved to be loved. And an understanding passed between them that needed no words. Something had been done to their father. They did not know what. They might never know for certain. But the question that had hung over this family for 6 years was no longer something they kept in the dark. It was out in the light now, and it had teeth. That evening, the plan for tomorrow took its final shape. Lily and Samuel would drive the cattle toward Casper, making a show of it, leaving the ranch visibly empty. Kieran would stay behind, hidden in the barn with the marked cattle in the far pasture. Martha Kincaid would watch from the ridge 1/2 mile out. If Halstead's men came, they would catch them in the act. It was simple. It was clean. And it would not survive first contact with the enemy, because no plan ever did. After the planning was done and Samuel had gone out to take first watch on the barn, Lily stood at the kitchen window looking out at the dark and the stars and the shape of the mountains against the sky. She heard Kieran come up behind her but did not turn. Are you ready for tomorrow? She asked. As ready as I will ever be. She turned then and looked at him. His burned arms were bandaged in fresh cloth. His face was drawn with pain and fatigue. And those winter sky eyes were looking at her with something that was not pity, and not desire, and not admiration, but all three braided together into something she had no name for. If something goes wrong tomorrow, she said, if they come, and it is more than we bargained for, promise me you will get Samuel out. Whatever happens to me, to the ranch, to any of it, get my brother out. Kieran held her gaze. Nothing is going to happen to you, promise me. He was quiet for a long moment. I promise. But Lily, nothing is going to happen to you. You do not know that. No. But I know that you can shoot straighter than the sheriff and think clearer than the judge and fight harder than anyone I have met in 28 years of living. If anyone can get through tomorrow, it is you, she almost smiled. Almost. Then she went upstairs to try to sleep and failed, and lay in the dark listening to the wind and thinking about her father's chair, and the map on Halstead's desk, and the man in the barn who had said he was not leaving. Out on the porch, Samuel sat on the step with his whittling knife. He was not carving a horse this time. The shape under his hands was smaller, rounder, something that fit in a palm. He did not know what it was becoming. His hands seemed to know what they were doing, even if his mind did not. From the kitchen window, Kieran watched the boy's careful knife strokes in the lamplight, and felt something twist in his chest that he could not name. a wooden figure taking shape in a young man's hands. The world kept presenting him with echoes of Billy Pruitt, and each one hurt, and each one healed, and he was not sure there was a difference. Everything went wrong from the first minute, starting with the fact that it was not 4 riders coming over the ridge line, but 7, and one of them was Doc Whitfield. Lily saw them from the creek bed where she had circled back after making a show of driving the cattle east toward Casper. She had left Samuel on the main road with the herd and strict instructions to keep going until he reached the Henderson Ranch 5 miles out. Then she had doubled back through the draws and gullies she had known since childhood, moving fast and quiet, her father's rifle across her saddle, and her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her teeth. She had expected trouble. She had planned for trouble. She had not planned for this. 7 riders came down from the western hills in the last light of evening, moving in a loose line with the confidence of men who believed themselves unopposed. At the front rode Jake Morrison, a thick-necked ranch hand she recognized from Halstead's spread, the man who did the dirty work and did not ask questions. Behind him came 3 more hands, armed and hard-faced, the kind of men who hired their loyalty by the week. Behind them rode Richard Halstead, straight-backed on a fine black horse, his Eastern education evident in his posture and his impracticality, evident in the spotless coat he wore as though cattle rustling were a formal occasion. And behind Richard, flanked by 2 riders like a prisoner under escort, rode Doc Whitfield. Lily felt the ground drop out from under her. Doc was not there willingly. Even from this distance, she could see it in the slump of his shoulders, and the way his hands gripped the saddle horn like a man holding onto the edge of a cliff. His face was white in the fading light, and his spectacles were crooked, and he had the look of a man being marched to his own execution. She understood immediately. Halstead had found out that Doc was talking. Someone in town had seen them together, or Doc had confessed under pressure, or Halstead had simply guessed. It did not matter how. What mattered was that Halstead had brought Doc along for the same reason a kidnapper brought a hostage: insurance. If I go down, Doc goes down with me. You signed that certificate. You are as guilty as anyone. In the barn, Kieran heard them coming. He had positioned himself in the hayloft with a clear view of the yard and the pasture gate, his pistol in his lap and his burned arms aching, and his heart doing the slow, heavy rhythm it always did when violence was close. He had been a bounty hunter for 2 years and a drifter for 2 more, and he knew the sound of approaching riders, the way a rancher knew the sound of approaching weather. He counted the shapes against the sky and his stomach dropped. 7. Not 4, not 5. 7. Including someone who rode hunched and unwilling at the back of the line. He reached for his pistol and felt his hands begin to shake. Below in the yard, the riders dismounted. Morrison sent 2 men to check the barn and the house, while the others moved to the pasture gate, where the marked cattle were penned. The plan had been simple. Wait for them to take the cattle. Let them move the animals to Halstead land. Then reveal the markings and present the evidence. Clean, contained, no shooting necessary. That plan was dead now. The barn door opened and a man stepped inside with a lantern. Kieran held his breath in the hayloft, pressed flat against the boards, his pistol in his hand, and his hands refusing to be still. The man below moved through the barn, checking stalls, kicking hay bales, working his way methodically toward the ladder. Kieran closed his eyes. He thought about Billy Pruitt. He thought about the wooden gun. He thought about the sound it made when it hit the wet stone. Then he thought about Lily, and what these men would do if they found him, and knew that she was out there alone. He opened his eyes and raised the pistol, his hands locked. The tremor ran through his arms like electricity, and the barrel wavered and danced, and he could not make his finger close on the trigger. The man looked up, saw him, shouted. The next seconds happened in a rush of noise and movement. The man grabbed for his gun. Kieran tried to fire and could not. The man's shot went wide, punching through the hayloft boards an inch from Kieran's ear. Kieran rolled sideways, fell from the loft, hit the barn floor hard enough to see stars. Morrison was there in an instant. He slammed the butt of his pistol across Kieran's temple with the casual efficiency of a man who had done it before, and the world went white, and then red, and then dark at the edges. When Kieran's vision cleared, he was on his knees in the yard with his hands tied behind his back and blood running down his face. Morrison stood over him with a look of professional disinterest. Richard Halstead was examining Kieran's pistol with the curiosity of a collector examining a new acquisition. And in the shadows by the barn, Doc Whitfield sat on the ground with his face in his hands, a man watching his last hope unravel. "Well," Richard said, holding up the wanted poster that Morrison had found in the barn. "Kieran Zachary, $500, dead or alive." He looked at Morrison. "This is the man Miss Catherine has been harboring on her property. A wanted killer." Morrison grunted. "The bounty is private, not territorial. Nevertheless, the law will be interested to know that Lily Catherine has been sheltering a fugitive. That adds obstruction to her already precarious legal situation." Richard smiled the way his father smiled, without warmth. "I believe this simplifies things considerably." Out in the darkness beyond the yard, Lily Catherine lay flat on the ridge above the ranch with her father's rifle and a clear view of everything. She could see Kieran on his knees. She could see the blood on his face. She could see the 7 men and their horses and their guns and the lamplight throwing long shadows across the dirt. She could not see Samuel. Samuel was 5 miles east with the cattle herd. Safe. Out of this, exactly where she needed him to be. She was alone. One woman with a rifle against 7 armed men. The odds were impossible. The math did not work. No rational person would engage. Lily Catherine had not been rational since the day she was born. But something stopped her. Not fear, not hesitation. Something worse. Memory. The porch steps. Tom Slade falling. The second shot. The one she could never explain or justify, the one that might have been rage. She lay on the ridge with her finger on the trigger and felt the old question rising in her like bile. If she shot now, would it be to save Kieran? Or would it be to punish the men who had burned her shed and killed her horse and stolen her cattle and maybe killed her father? Did the reason matter if the result was the same? She breathed. In through the nose, out through the mouth. The way she had taught Kieran. The way her father had taught her. And then she fired. Not at a man, at the rope. The first shot severed the line tying the horses to the corral fence. 7 horses, suddenly free, bolted in 7 directions, scattering into the darkness with the panicked energy of animals freed from restraint. The yard erupted in chaos. The second shot hit the lantern in Morrison's hand. Glass shattered and kerosene sprayed in an arc that caught the dry grass and bloomed into a line of flame that split the yard in 2. Morrison dove sideways, cursing. The third shot knocked Richard Halstead's pistol from his holster before his hand could close around the grip. The weapon spun through the air and landed in the dirt 10 feet away. Richard stared at his empty hand in disbelief. The fourth shot punched through the crown of a ranch hand's hat, lifting it clean off his head without touching a hair. The man hit the ground and stayed there, his courage evaporating like water on a hot skillet. 4 shots, 4 messages. Each one said the same thing in a language every man in that yard understood perfectly. "I can kill you. I am choosing not to. Do not make me reconsider." In the chaos, while the horses scattered and the fire divided the yard and the men scrambled for cover, Doc Whitfield did the bravest thing he had done in 6 years. He crawled through the dirt to where Kieran knelt, pulled a pocket knife from his coat, and cut the ropes binding Kieran's wrists. Morrison saw him and swung a fist that connected with Doc's face with a sound like a wet branch breaking. Doc's nose shattered. Blood poured down his shirt. He fell backward into the dirt. But Kieran's hands were free. Kieran grabbed Doc under the arms and hauled him upright, and they ran. Across the yard, through the gap in the fire line, into the darkness beyond the barn. Lily was already moving, scrambling down from the ridge to meet them, her rifle hot in her hands and her breath coming in great heaving gulps. They mounted Lily's horse, 3 of them on one animal, and rode hard toward the mountains. Behind them, Morrison was shouting orders, and the ranch hands were chasing horses, and the fire was eating its way across the dry grass of the yard. And then a shot from the darkness hit Kieran in the left shoulder, and he jerked forward against Lily's back, and she felt the warm spread of blood soaking through her shirt. "You are hit," she said. "Keep riding," Kieran gasped. They rode. The night swallowed them. The sounds of the ranch faded behind them, the shouts and the fire and the hoofbeats of men trying to organize a pursuit in the dark. Kieran's blood ran warm down Lily's back. Doc clung to the horse with a broken nose and shaking hands, and the wild eyes of a man who had just chosen a side and burned every bridge behind him. They rode toward the mountains and the darkness, and the one slim chance they had left. Doc Whitfield pulled the bullet out with a pair of forceps he had been carrying in his coat pocket for 30 years, working by candlelight in an abandoned miner's cabin, while the woman he had wronged held the hand of the man he was trying to save. The cabin sat high on the mountainside above Redstone Creek, a relic of the silver rush that had built the town and the bust that had nearly killed it. Stone walls 2 feet thick, a roof that leaked in 3 places, a fireplace that drew badly, and a door that did not close all the way. But it was shelter, and it was hidden, and for now it was enough. Martha Kincaid was already there when they arrived. Lily had sent word to her before the plan began, an escape route in case everything went sideways, because Lily Catherine planned for failure the same way she planned for success, thoroughly and without sentimentality. Martha had brought blankets and water and the medical supplies she kept at the boarding house for the miners who could not afford Doc's fees. Kieran lay on a blanket on the stone floor with his shirt cut away, and the bullet wound in his left shoulder exposed to the flickering candlelight. The bullet had gone in clean but deep, lodging against the bone without shattering it, and Doc said that was lucky, if any man with a bullet in him could be called lucky. Lily held Kieran's hand through the surgery. His grip was crushing, the grip of a man holding on to consciousness through sheer force of will, and she held on just as tight. She did not pretend she was not scared. She did not armor herself in competence or bristle with false strength. For the first time since Thomas Catherine's death, Lily let someone see her afraid. And it was the bravest thing she had ever done, braver than the shooting, braver than standing against 7 men, braver than any act of marksmanship she had performed in 12 years of handling her father's rifle. The forceps went in. Kieran's body arched off the blanket, and a sound came out of him that was not a scream, but something worse. Something animal and involuntary. Doc worked with the steady hands that decades of practice had given him, hands that did not shake even when the rest of him was shaking apart. The bullet came out, a misshapen lump of lead that Doc dropped into a tin cup with a sound like a pebble hitting a bell. He packed the wound with clean cloth and bound it tight and sat back on his heels and said, "He has lost blood, but the bone is intact, and if infection does not set in, he will live." Lily did not let go of Kieran's hand. He drifted into fever as the night deepened. His skin burned under Lily's palm, and his eyes moved behind closed lids, and he spoke in the broken language of delirium, fragments of sentences that surfaced and sank like wreckage in a flood. "Kid, I am sorry. I did not know it was wood. I did not know." Lily looked at Doc across the body of the man between them, and Doc looked back, and in the candlelight his battered face was a landscape of guilt and grief and exhaustion. "Tell me," Lily said. Doc took off his broken spectacles and wiped them on his blood-stained sleeve and put them back on crooked and began to speak. He told her about the death certificate, about Halstead's instruction, about the decision he had made 6 years ago in this very territory, in this very situation of a powerful man telling a weaker one what to write, and the weaker one complying because compliance was easier than courage. He told me to write heart failure. And God help me, Lily, I did it. I did not examine your father properly. I did not test for anything. Thomas came to my office 2 weeks before he died complaining of stomach pains. I treated him for indigestion. But the symptoms, looking back now with 6 years of hindsight and 6 years of nightmares, The symptoms could have been consistent with slow poisoning. Arsenic, strychnine. Something administered in small doses over time. I do not know. I will never know because I did not look, and now the body is in the ground and the truth is buried with it. He stopped. Tears were running down his face, cutting tracks through the dried blood from his broken nose. I have been a coward for 6 years, Kieran. Every time I look at Lily, I see Thomas's face, and I want to crawl into the ground and never come out. Lily listened to all of it, every word. She let Doc empty himself of 6 years of poison, because that was what it was. A kind of poison, slow and corrosive and ultimately more destructive than anything Halstead could have put in a cup. When Doc finished, Lily released Kieran's hand. She stood up. She walked to the cabin door and stood in the frame, looking out at the dark mountains and the stars scattered across the Wyoming sky like someone had thrown a handful of diamonds on black cloth. The wind was cold at this altitude, and it cut through her blood-stained shirt, and she did not care. She did not cry. She had not cried since her father's funeral, and she would not cry now, not for grief, not for rage, not for the devastating, quiet realization that the man who had brought her into this world had also failed to protect the man who raised her. When she spoke, her voice was perfectly steady. The voice of a woman who had just absorbed a blow that would have broken lesser people and had decided in the space between one heartbeat and the next to remain standing. You will testify. Everything. The death certificate. Halstead's instruction. What you did and what you failed to do. In front of the whole town. Doc's voice was barely a whisper. Yes. And then, you and I are finished. I will never forgive you for this. She went back to Kieran's side and took his hand again. The contrast was so sharp it could cut glass. The ice in her voice when she spoke to Doc. The tenderness with which she cradled the unconscious man's hand. She was capable of both, and neither one was a lie. Kieran's fever broke some time after midnight. He opened his eyes and found Lily sitting beside him with her back against the stone wall and his hand in both of hers and a look on her face that he had never seen before. Open. Unguarded. As if she had finally set down the rifle she carried inside her, the one she aimed at anyone who got too close. "Hey," he said. His voice was a rasp. "Hey," she said. "What happened? You got shot." Doc took the bullet out. "You are going to be fine." He looked at her for a long moment. "And you? Are you fine?" Lily considered this. "No," she said honestly. "I am not fine. I do not think I have been fine in a very long time. But I am here. And I need to tell you something. All right. I do not need you to save me. I have never needed anyone to save me. I can shoot straighter than the sheriff, and I can run this ranch, and I can face down 7 men in the dark. I do not need saving, I know that. But I want you here. Not for the ranch, not for the cattle, not because you can track and I need a tracker. I want you here because when I am with you, I do not feel like I have to carry everything alone, and I did not know how heavy it all was until you showed up and I started to feel it less." Kieran's burned hand tightened around hers. "I have wanted to stay since the day you shot that bottle before the sheriff could blink," he said. "Then stay." She leaned down and kissed him. It was not graceful. He was fevered and bandaged and lying on a stone floor in a miner's cabin. She had not slept in 2 days, and there was blood on her shirt, and her hands were blistered from pulling a burning fence rail. Doc was pretending to clean his spectacles in the corner, and Martha was keeping watch outside, and the whole thing was about as far from romantic as a kiss could get. It was real, and real was enough. Martha came in an hour later with news that landed like a second bullet. "Halstead has declared Kieran a dangerous fugitive. Coleman has issued warrants for both of you. Harboring a wanted criminal, obstruction of justice. The ranch is sealed pending investigation. Your cattle, your house, your property, all of it is locked up behind Halstead's authority." Lily absorbed this the way she absorbed everything. Quietly, completely, without visible reaction. Then she said, "So we have lost everything." "Not everything," Doc said slowly. He was cleaning his broken spectacles on his blood-spotted sleeve, a nervous habit that he seemed unable to control. "3 weeks ago, before any of this happened, I sent a letter to United States Marshal Henry Stokes in Cheyenne. I included documentation of Halstead's land fraud, the foreclosures, the pattern. Stokes has jurisdiction over county-level corruption in the territory. He is coming. How long? 2 days. Maybe 3. Lily closed her eyes. 2 days. They needed to survive 2 days in hiding, with Kieran wounded and Doc broken, and Coleman's warrants hanging over them. Or they needed to stop hiding. "There is one way," Doc said, and the words came out carefully as if he were handling something fragile. "But it requires you to do the most reckless thing you have ever done. More reckless than out shooting the sheriff in the town square." "What?" "You surrender. Publicly, in front of the whole town. You invoke your right to a public hearing. Halstead is the justice of the peace. He cannot refuse a citizen's request for a hearing without abandoning the legal authority that gives him his power." Lily opened her eyes. "You want me to walk into Halstead's courtroom and demand he try me in public? I want you to force him onto his own stage, in front of everyone, where every lie he tells will be heard by 300 witnesses." The silence in the cabin was absolute. Outside, the wind moved through the pines. Somewhere far below, Redstone Creek slept under Halstead's shadow, waiting without knowing it for the morning that was coming. Lily looked at Kieran. Kieran looked back. "I will be right there with you," he said. "You can barely stand. Then I will be right there next to you, sitting down." She almost laughed. Almost. And in that almost was every bit of love and terror and hope that she had spent 6 years refusing to feel. "All right," she said. "We go back. We walk into his courtroom, and we burn it down." "Not literally," Martha said from the doorway. Lily smiled for the first time in days. "Not literally, but close." Lily Catherine rode into the town square of Redstone Creek at high noon, a wanted woman with a rifle on her saddle, and did the one thing nobody expected. She walked straight into the judge's courthouse and sat down in the public gallery to wait. The news spread through town like a fire through dry brush. Within an hour, every soul in Redstone Creek knew that the Catherine woman had surrendered herself and was demanding a public hearing. Within 2 hours, the church was packed to the walls, because the church was the only building large enough to hold the crowd that wanted to watch. Martha Kincaid had been busy. In the 2 days since the disaster at the ranch, she had moved through Redstone Creek like a force of nature, quiet and relentless, visiting every farm and ranch and boarding house in the territory. She told them what she knew. She told them what Doc Whitfield was prepared to testify. She told them about the cattle theft and the arson and the mortgage and the geological survey. And she told them that Lily Catherine was going to face Judge Halstead in public, and that every person who had ever been squeezed or cheated or bullied by that man owed it to themselves to be there when it happened. They came. Lord, how they came. Ranchers and miners and shopkeepers and their wives. Old men who remembered when Redstone Creek was young. Young men who had never seen anything more exciting than a Saturday night brawl. Women who had been told to stay home and brought their children anyway. The church was standing room only, bodies packed into every pew and lining the walls and crowding the doorway 3 deep. Halstead entered through the vestry door, and Lily had to credit him. The man knew how to command a room. He wore his dark suit and his silver watch chain and the expression of a reasonable man being forced to deal with unreasonable circumstances. He took his seat at the front of the church, behind a table that served as a bench, and called the hearing to order with the quiet authority of someone who had been running this town for 20 years and intended to run it for 20 more. The charges were read. Lily Catherine, harboring a known fugitive. Obstruction of justice. Interference with lawful enforcement. Coleman stood as the primary witness, uncomfortable in his formal coat, his mustache freshly waxed, his eyes not quite meeting anyone else's. Lily sat at a table facing Halstead. She wore a clean dress borrowed from Martha. Her dark hair was pulled back tight. Her father's rifle leaned against the wall behind her, and everyone in the room could see it, and everyone in the room knew what she could do with it. Beside her sat Kieran. His arm was in a sling and his face was pale from blood loss, and he had no business being upright, let alone in a public hearing. But he was there, steady and solid, and Lily drew strength from his presence the way a tree drew strength from its roots. The hearing began badly for Lily. Coleman testified that Kieran Zachary was a wanted man, that a poster bearing his name and likeness was posted at the sheriff's office, that Lily had knowingly employed him on her property. The facts were damning because they were true. Then Lily began to speak. She was not a lawyer. She had never been inside a courtroom. She had nothing but a ranch woman's common sense and a dead father's voice in her memory saying, "You look at the whole field, Lily girl, not just the fence right in front of you." "Sheriff Coleman," she said, and her voice carried to every corner of the packed church. "How many times have I come to your office to report cattle theft in the last 3 months?" Coleman shifted. "Several times." "How many exactly?" "I do not recall the exact number. I do. 11 times. 11 reports in 3 months. How many times did you ride out to my property to investigate?" Silence. A cough from somewhere in the crowd. "How many times, Sheriff?" Coleman's face was the color of old brick. "I was occupied with other matters." "Not once," Lily said. "Not one single time in 3 months did you set foot on my property to investigate a crime that cost me 11 head of cattle and the best horse on my ranch. And on the night in question, the night you claim I was harboring a fugitive, where were you?" "I was not present at the initial incident." "No, you were not. But Judge Halstead was, along with 7 armed men who rode onto my property after dark and assaulted a man in my barn. They pistol-whipped him. They tied him up. One of them shot him." She paused. "Would you like to explain, Sheriff, how you came to issue a warrant for my arrest based on the word of a man who led an armed raid on my ranch in the middle of the night?" The church murmured like a hive. Halstead interrupted smoothly. "Miss Catherine, the matter before this hearing is the charge of harboring a fugitive, not the circumstances of his discovery. Perhaps we could stay on topic." Lily turned to face him. She met his eyes with the same steady gaze she used when sighting down a rifle barrel. "Very well, Judge. Let us stay on topic." She nodded to Martha Kincaid, who stood from her seat in the front pew with a sheaf of papers in her hands, and the cold, patient expression of a woman who had been waiting for this moment for 2 years. Martha read. Testimony from the Gunther family, whose ranch had been foreclosed after a loan from Halstead's office came due at twice the agreed rate. Testimony from the Bishops, who had lost their homestead after Halstead's men diverted the creek that watered their land. Testimony from the widow Palmer, whose husband died of a sudden illness 6 weeks after refusing Halstead's offer to buy his property. The church went very quiet at that last one. A man dead of sudden illness after refusing to sell. The same pattern, the same convenient timing. Then Doc Whitfield stood up. He looked terrible. His nose was still swollen and discolored from Morrison's punch. His spectacles sat crooked on his face. His hands trembled. He was the picture of a man who had been broken and was holding himself together with nothing but the adhesive of necessity. 6 years ago, he said, and his voice cracked, but did not break. Catherine died on his ranch. I signed the death certificate. I wrote heart failure as the cause of death. He paused. The church was silent. Judge Halstead instructed me to write that. He told me it was a simple thing, just sign the paper and everything stays as it is. And I did it. I did not examine Thomas Catherine properly. I did not test for unusual substances. I did not do my duty as a physician. I was afraid of Judge Halstead, and my fear was more important to me than the truth. And I have lived with that shame every day for 6 years. He looked at Lily. She did not look back. I do not know if Thomas Catherine was murdered, Doc continued. I will never know, because I failed to gather the evidence that might have told us. But I know that his death was convenient for a man who wanted his land, and I know that I helped that convenience go unquestioned. I am prepared to answer to the Territorial Medical Board for my negligence, and I am prepared to answer to this town for my cowardice. He sat down. The silence that followed was the silence of 300 people rearranging their understanding of the world. Lily spoke again. She turned to the crowd. Is there anyone in this room who worked for Judge Halstead's private surveying operation? A man stood. Cal Riggins, former miner, fired from Halstead's employ 2 years ago for asking too many questions about a survey he was not supposed to see. Cal was lean and weather-beaten and angry in the way that only a man who's been silenced can be angry when he is finally given permission to speak. "I worked for the judge's survey crew in '71, Cal said. He hired a geological team from Denver to survey the Catherine property. They found a silver vein running under the creek bed. The report estimated significant mineral deposits. Halstead buried the report. I know because I took a copy before he fired me." He produced a folded document from his coat and held it up. A geological survey, grid lines, mineral annotations, the Catherine property outlined in red. The church erupted. Halstead's face changed, not into the panicked outburst of a lesser man, into something colder, harder, the mask of civility cracking to reveal the iron beneath. "You have no idea what you are doing, girl," he said, and his voice was low and venomous, and directed at Lily like a blade. "I built this town. I am this town." "No," Lily said quietly. "You are not. You are a man who steals from people who trust you, and this town deserves better." Richard Halstead had been sitting in the back of the church, watching his father's empire unravel. He was 26 years old, and he had spent his entire life trying to earn the approval of a man who measured worth in acres and ounces of silver. And now that man was losing everything, and Richard could see the future collapsing, and something in him broke. He drew a pistol. The church froze. 300 people held their breath. The barrel pointed at Lily, unsteady in Richard's shaking hand. And for a moment the world narrowed to the space between the gun and the woman it was aimed at. Kieran stood up, slowly, painfully, his left arm in a sling and his face white as paper. He stepped in front of Lily and faced Richard with empty hands. "Go ahead," Kieran said. His voice was quiet and steady, and it carried to every corner of the room. "Shoot an unarmed man, in a church, in front of 300 witnesses. Show everyone here exactly what the Halstead name means." Richard's hand shook. The barrel wavered. His eyes were wild and wet, and in them you could see the war between the man his father had made him and the man he might have been. He could not do it. He was not his father. Not yet. Not quite. Samuel appeared from the side wall, quiet as a shadow, and kicked the gun from Richard's hand. It skittered across the wooden floor and came to rest at Coleman's boots. Coleman looked at it for a long moment. Then he looked at Richard. Then he looked at Lily. Then he bent down, picked up the gun, and took Richard Halstead by the arm. "Sit down, son," Coleman said. It was the first useful thing the sheriff had done in 3 months. The church doors opened. Sunlight poured in, and with it came 3 men wearing the badges of the United States Marshal Service. Henry Stokes was in front, a big man with a gray beard and hard eyes, and the particular authority of someone who derived his power not from money or fear, but from the law itself. He carried warrants, fraud, coercion, land theft, obstruction of justice. Not murder, because there was not enough proof for that, and the story was honest about it. Thomas Catherine's death remained an open question, a wound that would never fully close. "Emmett Halstead," Stokes said, "you are under arrest by order of the Territorial Court. You will be transported to the Wyoming Territorial Prison in Laramie to await trial." Halstead stood. He buttoned his coat. He straightened his watch chain. And he walked out of the church with the dignity of a man who had lost everything and refused to show it, escorted by 2 deputies who took his arms at the door. Richard was placed in custody at the Redstone Creek County Jail, where he would serve 6 months after cooperating as a witness against his father. Coleman handed his badge to Stokes without being asked. He looked at Lily one last time. "You could outshoot me," he said. "Turns out you could outthink me, too." Lily did not respond. She did not need to win against Coleman. She had won against something much bigger. Stokes turned to Kieran. "I reviewed your file, Mr. Zachary. The Abilene matter was court-cleared. Justifiable force, no criminal record. The Pruitt bounty is private and carries no legal standing in any territory." He paused. "You are a free man. You do not owe anyone anything. He glanced at Lily. Except maybe that woman right there. One more thing, Stokes said, producing the geological survey Cal Riggins had provided. The silver deposit is on Catherine land. Miss Catherine is the legal owner. He looked at Lily. That vein could be worth a considerable sum, ma'am. What do you intend to do with it? Lily looked through the church window at the land beyond the town, the grassland and the mountains and the sky, the ranch where her father had raised her, where he had taught her to shoot and to count cattle and to read the weather and to love the earth she stood on. My father found that silver, she said. He decided to raise cattle instead. I reckon he knew what he was doing. The silver would stay in the ground, the land would stay in the family. It was not the smart choice. It was the right one. Kieran smiled. The first real smile in days. Your father was a wise man. He was, Lily said. He just did not have enough time to prove it. She looked at the mountains and thought, but I do. 3 months after Judge Halstead was escorted to Laramie in irons. The strangest thing to happen in Redstone Creek was not the trial or the silver scandal. It was Kieran Zachary's hands shaking so badly he nearly dropped the wedding ring. The weeks between the hearing and the wedding passed the way seasons change in Wyoming, quickly and without sentiment. Redstone Creek remade itself the way frontier towns did, tearing down what was rotten and building up what was sound, and not spending too much time mourning what was lost. A new sheriff was elected, a quiet rancher named Tom Briggs, who ran unopposed because nobody else wanted the job. He was not brilliant, he was not brave, but he was honest. And after Wade Coleman, honest felt like a miracle. Halstead's ranch was sold to pay restitution. The proceeds were divided among the families he had defrauded, the Gunthers and the Bishops and the widow Palmer, and all the others who had suffered under a system designed to take what was theirs and call it legal. Lily's share was enough to clear the mortgage, hire 2 hands, and repair the barn. The tack shed was rebuilt. Kieran insisted on doing it himself, even with the scars on his arm still pink and tight, and the shoulder wound not fully healed. He worked slowly and carefully, measuring twice and cutting once, and when it was finished, it was better than the original. Sturdier, more square. A building made by a man who intended to stay. On a cool October morning, with the aspens turning gold on the mountainside and the first frost silvering the grass, Kieran sat at the kitchen table in the Catherine ranch house and wrote a letter. Dear Mrs. Pruitt, he began. He wrote slowly. Each word cost him something. He did not ask for forgiveness. He had no right to ask that. He told her what happened, the alley, the rain, the shape in the dark, her son's face, the wooden gun. He told her that Billy had died quickly, and that Kieran had held his hand, and that he was sorry with every piece of himself that was capable of being sorry. He enclosed a bank draft from the restitution money, enough to establish a small trust at the Abilene schoolhouse in Billy Pruitt's name, for children who wanted to learn and could not afford the books. He sealed the letter and gave it to the mail coach and stood in the street for a long time afterward, watching the dust settle. He did not expect a reply. Some debts could not be paid. They could only be carried. Doc Whitfield had testified fully at Halstead's trial in Cheyenne. He held nothing back. When it was over, he surrendered his medical license to the Territorial Board, admitting to negligence in the death certificate of Thomas James Catherine. He would not practice medicine again. Lily had not spoken to him since the night in the cabin. She had not forgiven him. She was not sure she ever would. Forgiveness was not something you could force, not even on yourself. And Lily had stopped trying. On the morning of the wedding, she found a package on the front porch. A leather bag, old and cracked and worn smooth by 30 years of use. Doc's medical bag, the one he had carried through the war, through 1,000 house calls, through the delivery of half the children in Redstone Creek. Inside was a note, written in Doc's careful hand. This bag brought you into the world, Lily Catherine. I am sorry I could not protect the man who raised you. I hope you find it in yourself someday, not to forgive me, but to understand. It was signed with a single letter. Lily read it, standing on the porch where her father used to drink his evening coffee, where Tom Slade had died 2 years ago, where she had pushed Kieran away, and he had refused to go. She read it twice, and then she folded it and put it in the wooden box where she kept her father's things: his pocket watch, his reading glasses, a lock of her mother's hair. She closed the lid. Understanding might come. It might not. But the box was there, and the note was in it, and that was enough for now. The wedding was small, the way both of them wanted it. They held it at the ranch under the oak tree that Thomas Catherine had planted the year Lily was born. The tree had grown tall in 24 years, its branches spreading wide enough to shade the ceremony and the dozen people gathered beneath it. Martha Kincaid baked the cake, a towering construction of flour and sugar and determination that leaned slightly to the left, but tasted like heaven. The Henderson family came, and the Gunthers, and old Cal Riggins, who had kept a stolen geological survey in his coat pocket for 2 years, waiting for the right moment to produce it. Samuel stood as best man. He wore a white shirt that was slightly too big because he was 16 and still growing, still becoming whatever he would eventually be. And the shirt hung on his thin shoulders in a way that reminded everyone present that this was still a boy, still a child, still someone who deserved the chance to be young. He had not been given that chance, not yet. But standing there under the oak tree, watching his sister marry the man who had helped save their home, Samuel Catherine looked something close to happy for the first time since his father's death. The vows were not traditional. Neither were the people making them. Kieran stood facing Lily with the ring in his scarred hand and the Wyoming sky enormous and blue above them, and spoke without notes, because the words came from a place that did not need paper. I do not promise to be perfect. I promise to be here. Every day, including the hard ones, including when the nightmares come, including when my hands shake and I am afraid of what they have done. I promise I will never run again. I spent 2 years running and it brought me here to you, and I am done moving. This is where I stop. This is where I stay. Lily held his hands in hers, the scarred and the blistered, the burned and the calloused, and spoke her own vows with the steady voice that never trembled except when it mattered. I promise I will never hide what I am. I will not be less for anyone. I will not apologize for being strong or stubborn or difficult or for shooting straighter than the sheriff. And I promise that I will not push you away again, even when I'm scared, even when every instinct tells me to lock the gates and man the walls. I will let you in. That is the hardest promise I have ever made, and I will keep it. Kieran smiled. The smile that transformed his face, that turned the hard plains and shadows into something warm and open and real. I need a partner exactly like you, he said. And I found one. Yes, you did, Lily said. They kissed under the oak tree while their small gathering applauded, and Martha dabbed her eyes with a handkerchief, and Samuel made a sound that was halfway between a groan and a laugh. The celebration was modest. Martha's cake and the Hendersons' fiddle and a bonfire in the yard as the sun went down. People danced and ate and talked and laughed, and the Catherine Ranch rang with sounds it had not heard in 6 years. Joy, community, the noise of a family expanding. As the evening deepened and the guests began to drift home, Lily and Kieran sat on the porch. She held her father's rifle across her knees out of habit. He held a cup of coffee that had gone cold. The sky was turning purple at the edges, and the first stars were coming out, faint and persistent, the way stars always were in Wyoming. They sat in comfortable silence, the kind that takes weeks and wounds and arguments and forgiveness to earn. The kind that 2 people build between them not with words, but with the daily accumulation of trust, one morning at a time, one crisis at a time, one choice to stay at a time. Samuel appeared in the doorway behind them. He was holding something in both hands, and his face wore an expression Lily had never seen on him before. Shy, uncertain. The face of a boy offering something precious, and not sure it would be accepted. He set the object on the porch rail between them. It was a wooden gun, small enough to fit in a palm, carved from pine and sanded smooth until it gleamed in the lamplight. The detail was extraordinary. The barrel was straight and true. The grip was shaped to fit a hand. Every line of it spoke of hours and hours of patient work, of a boy sitting on the porch step night after night with a knife in his hands and something in his heart that needed making. Lily recognized the carving style. It was their father's style. The precise, careful strokes Thomas Catherine had taught his son in the evenings after supper, when the work was done and the world was quiet and a man could teach a boy that hands were meant for creating before they were meant for destroying. "For the wall," Samuel said. His voice was rough. "So we remember that not everything that looks like a weapon is one." Kieran picked it up. His scarred hands closed around the smooth wood, the wood that was warm from Samuel's grip, the wood that had been shaped by the same impulse that had shaped a toy gun, in another boy's father's hands a lifetime ago in another town. A wooden gun, not a weapon, a gift, a bridge between the boy Kieran had killed and the boy who stood before him now. A piece of carved pine that said, "I heard you calling out in your fever. I heard you say his name. I heard your grief. And I made this because making is what my father taught me. And maybe what was made in violence can be remade in grace." Kieran's eyes were wet. He nodded once and could not speak. Samuel turned and went inside, his part done, his gift given. And Lily listened to his footsteps on the stairs and thought about how much he had grown and how much growing he still had to do. She leaned her head against Kieran's shoulder and looked at the Wyoming sky, wide from horizon to horizon, the way her father always said a sky should be. Room to breathe, room to see the edges of the world and know that the world was bigger than your troubles. The wooden gun sat on the porch rail, catching the last light of the day. Inside the house, the coffee was getting cold. Neither of them got up to fix it. Somewhere in the valley, a calf bawled for its mother. The wind moved through the grass. The mountains held still. She could shoot straighter than the sheriff. He had said he needed a partner exactly like her. And together they had built something out of broken pieces and old grief, and the stubborn refusal to let go of land or love or each other. Home. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.